Welcome to Digging Deeper, a podcast of Perimeter Church in Atlanta, Georgia, hosted by me, Jeff Norris, along with my co-host, Laura Story Elvington. This podcast aims to equip you to follow Jesus by digging deeper into the teachings and topics of the Bible, the culture at large, and life in general. We're excited that you've joined us as we explore the treasures of God's Word and apply its teachings to our lives as followers of Christ.
In this season, we're digging deeper into our series, Love Rules, a study through the Ten Commandments and their relevance to us today. So throughout this season, we'll feature many exciting guests who will help us sort through what Scripture has to say and how it impacts how we're to live as citizens of the kingdom of God.
We're so glad you've joined us. Now let's jump into today's discussion. We are so glad that you have tuned in with us again for episode 3 of our Digging Deeper series as we walk through the Ten Commandments and do exactly what the title says. We dig deeper into each one, trying to glean more and more from not only the commandments, but really about our God and what He has designed for us. And so, as always, I'm joined by with Laura, and today, oh my goodness, we have a great guest that I can't wait for you to hear from, Kelly Kapic. Kelly has become a good friend and a guy that I just look up to tremendously. Kelly, thanks for joining us. Tell us a little bit about yourself. What do you do? Where do you live? What does the Lord have you up to?
Yeah, thank you so much. This is a delight to be with you. Listeners who are not watching were wondering, Will this voice be male or female? Let's see. I teach at a place called Covenant College. It's actually the PCA's denominational college on Lookout Mountain, Georgia, right between Georgia and Tennessee, above Chattanooga, Tennessee. I've been teaching here since 2001. My wife and I got married in 1993. We just celebrated 30 years of marriage.
Awesome.
And I get to pour into college students on a regular basis, which is wonderful.
Yeah, it's awesome. So good, so good. And you've written a number of books. In fact, here I'm going to do something real quick just to embarrass you. I'm going to. You've written a lot of great books. I wish I could say I've read all of them, but I have read many of them.
You're kind.
And so I'll just mention a few. Communion with God, God So Loved He Gave, one of my favorites. Tremendous book written back in 2010. Becoming Whole, which that's one I haven't read, Kelly, but someone just literally maybe 3 days ago from recording this said, I'm reading it. You've got to read it. It's fantastic.
That's kind.
The God Who Gives. And then a couple others I'll mention, the last one being the one that we kind of want to tap into in our conversation today, but Embodied Hope. And then You're Only Human. And we actually have You're Only Human sitting right here. I'm going to probably at some point read a quote or two from that. And it ties into the You're Only Human thesis, if you will, of what you write about in here. Ties into, in some ways, with the fourth commandment, which is what we want to talk about. And God's design for humans and for our flourishing under His rule and reign, to Sabbath, to have a Sabbath. So I'm going to do something real quick. I'm going to read the actual commandment. It's a bit longer than people might think. They may say, well, okay, yeah, remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. That's the part we remember.
Right.
But let me read the rest. It says, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant, your livestock or the sojourner who is with you in your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. Therefore, the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Okay, so we're going to come back specifically to that command. But so I zoomed in, but I want to zoom out again, and then we'll zoom back in, okay? I want to zoom out to just ask you this question, Kelly.
Yeah.
The Ten Commandments as a whole. The first commandment, really everything falls underneath that. There should be no other gods before me. In other words, common vernacular, we may say, keep God first. How is that to our benefit? What is it that God is really trying to establish for us, for human flourishing, in the first commandment, but then how all the others flow from that?
Yeah, those are great questions, and I love that how you guys are trying to approach this. I think one of the, you know, since we're stepping back, it is interesting to be reminded because I know I need to be reminded of this. Like, God doesn't just think, I really want to come up with some creative rules to see if people will follow them. You know what I
That's
mean?
great. Yeah.
Like, but sometimes that's how we treat it, whether we're talking about, in the garden or Leviticus, something like God just likes to make rules, not because they correspond to anything, but just he wants to see if we're going to obey him or not.
Yeah.
And the rule could be something wicked or good. He just arbitrarily decides, right? And when that's the case, it makes obedience, it makes faithfulness very difficult. And so the commandments really have to be grounded both in God's character and then the goodness of how he made the world. And in a sense, the commandments are just a reminder of reality.
Yeah.
The 10 commandments are just, this is actually who God is and how the world works. We can go against them, but it hurts us. It hurts, the Hebrew of shalom. It hurts the peace that we are meant to have with God, neighbor, and the rest of creation. And so I do think it's interesting, we start with, know their gods. But given that these commandments are given to us after the fall, it is interesting, I'm sure like when you guys have talked about this, we often in our circles call it a prelude where God delivered out of Egypt. But in Jewish settings and other settings, sometimes that's actually considered part of the first commandment. Because that is the indicator in this fallen world of who this God is. So it's not just he's God, and this is the kind of God he is. And so it's worth listening to him and following him.
That's good.
That's great. Yeah. And even just to skip more into the book, You're Only Human, I'm assuming that a lot of what you're talking about here kind of really comes from that first commandment of when we recognize that God is God, he is creator, then we need to recognize something about ourselves as well.
Yeah, exactly. That in our confession that God is God, we're also confessing that we are humans. And our churches, well, actually not a lot of churches, but in our tradition, in the Reformed tradition, for example, we regularly do a confession of sin, which is really important. But part of our confession, whether we're reciting the Nicene Creed or these other statements, is this reminder that God is God, we are sinners, but assumed and thus easily forgotten is the fact we're actually humans and we were made good. And sin is not what's most true about us. What's most true about us is that we were made good by God. And the reason sin's a problem is because that's not good. And so it messes us up in his world.
So are our limitations, are they the product of sin? Or
Yeah,
are limitations how God made us?
That's a good question. Part of what I'm trying to argue, obviously, in the book is we confuse limits and sin all the time.
Yeah.
And limits are part of the good way God made us. And so, the fancy word there is finitude, but that just means limits, limited in time, space, knowledge, power. And we sometimes, just to put it very clearly, I think we feel guilty that we're not being able to do more, that we don't know more, like we should always read more and we should be more active in these things and we should get our kids to more activities. There's always more, and part of that, and in Christian circles, then we baptize that. And so we think the fact that we're not doing these things or being these being these kind of people, it must be sin. When actually some of it's just God made you and I to have bodies, to be in particular places, to have limits, to have backgrounds. So I'm trying to help us untangle sin and finitude or sin and limits.
Oh, that's good.
You were with us, when were you with our staff? 2 months ago or something like that? I can't remember.
Something like it. It's a blur, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a blur, but man, it was so good. You spent the day with our staff and
that was fun.
teaching on some of these really helpful frameworks that you give about finitude and embracing our limits, and how embracing our limits is not the same as embracing our sin in many ways. I'm going to read this one little quote here from the book. It says, "We also tend to mistake our natural human limits as faults we must overcome. But when our search for identity in Christ includes a healthy view of creaturely finitude and particularity, then we see something truly beautiful and unique take shape. the church starts to look like it was meant to look: diverse, united, gracious, and most of all, loving, all in and around Christ. I love that, and what you're talking about here. And so here's the question of, as we move into talking specifically about this fourth commandment, what's God's design, given that we are human, and we never want to be okay with sin, but helping to have discernment between what is sinful and what is just part of being human and being limited and not being finite creatures and not infinite.
Right.
What's God's design for the Sabbath? How is He helping us? How is the Sabbath helping us in that endeavor?
Yeah, I think the Sabbath is so wonderfully countercultural. When we sometimes talk about it, it's just like, we know we're supposed to talk about the Sabbath, so let's do it. But it's kind of like
Get it over with.
I got to go to the dentist, so let's do it.
Yeah.
So let's kind of approach this in a slightly different way, and then make sure I land it in the place you want the plane landed. But it even hearing you talk about it and thinking about the God making this Sabbath. I was speaking to a group of high school students this summer, and kind of presenting some of these very things, right? And at the end, there was time of Q&A, and it was great. High schoolers are great; they're willing to ask questions, and hands went up, and I could tell that this one kid, I couldn't tell at first until he started to ask, and he said, "I got 3 questions." I'm like, "What? Okay." He's the first one. And immediately I could tell he was really wrestling, and he thought he had me, and it was great, right? So he said, "Question number 1, does God have limits?" And I'm like, don't ask a theologian. Things are like, he can't sin, but that's not really a limit. So I know your answer is no, God doesn't have limits. He said, good. He said, question 2, are we made in God's image? And I said, yes. And then he said, then 3, why are you saying that we have limits? Now, and then he said, show me a verse, right? And it was so wonderful that he's willing to wrestle with this. So I'm trying to channel and be as nice as possible to eventually kind of say in as nice a way as possible, it's not one verse, it's every verse.
All of them.
Yeah.
Right? It's the fact that you're not God. But he's still young, he's got energy, and to be told he can't do everything, he's not responsible, it actually was offensive to him.
Yeah.
Right? And so I do think even the Sabbath's like, God rests, and it's so important for us to always remember the Sabbath is not just rest, it's entering into God's rest.
That's good.
Yep.
So anyways, I think that's a fascinating, it can betray misunderstanding of who God is that relates to misunderstanding what we're supposed to be like as well.
Well, can you tell us a little more about that? So what would be the difference in resting and entering into God's rest?
Yeah, that's great. Because what seems to happen, like in the Genesis narrative, is God day after day, he's like making it and he's delighting it. He's interconnecting, literally he creates a space, and then later he'll fill that space, right? The sky, and then the birds, and the fish and this kind of thing. But what seems to be the case is then after doing that work, he needs a day, whatever a day is, to just say, I love it. Right? And kind of this Jewish idea of satisfaction that you actually need to delight. And you think about this all the time where it's fascinating. People talk about striving, whether it's to get a particular job or, a Grammy. We were talking about this earlier, Laura, or whatever.
I love that you just said that. That's good.
we do these things. And I can't remember who originally said this, but the only thing worse than not getting what you want is getting what you want. Because when you get what you want, and then you're like, oh wait, that's it.
Yeah.
And because part of it is we struggle to delight in what God has given, what He has provided. You actually need rhythm of work and rest, work and delight and satisfaction. So, anyways, and I think entering into His satisfaction is seeing the world and Him as he's to be seen, as he sees himself. Something like that.
Go ahead.
Well, so it sounds like such an easy thing. You just rest on the Sabbath. What are the things that push back on this idea of resting, whether it's maybe misconceptions about ourselves, or maybe misconceptions about, are those rules really applicable today?
Sure. Yeah.
And coupled with that, Kelly, I mean, yes, I want to hear that, but I also want to hear your thoughts on how are we missing it as a church,
Yeah.
as a Christian people? What are we just not getting?
So how are we
about the
missing it?
Sabbath? How are we
and
missing
why
it?
are we missing
And
it?
why? Yeah, there we go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, part of it is we really do struggle with rest, I think, or at least a lot of us do. And I think even culturally we're confused, what's rest? Maybe we've completely now entertainment has subsumed the whole idea of rest. And so I just think that that's very difficult. And in Christian circles, when we're not working, we think we're not redeeming the time or something. We think we're not using our time well. We're not honoring God. So, the example I use sometimes is just as a sign of how the church we've created some issues. Is I teach at a Christian college. I have students from all kinds of different denominations, and a lot of the students will tell you if they don't study on Sunday, they feel guilty. They're being lazy. They're not keeping up. Now, some of it's just we give them so much work, and I understand, but that, like, spiritually, what's going on? Where if they rest. If they say, I'm not going to do homework on Sunday, I'm going to go to church, I'm going to have a feast with friends, I'm going to take a nap, I'm going to take a walk in nature, I'm going to do that, they actually feel guilty and feel guilty before God. To me, that's a great sign of us needing to go, wait, what's happened here?
Yeah.
In what way, it's not in Proverbs, it's Ben Franklin who said time is money. But we kind of baptized that.
Yeah.
And we're not, it's not necessarily we're looking for money, but we really think you got to use every minute to be productive. And every minute should be efficient. And part of what God is saying to us on the Sabbath is you're not going to be able to worship if you're not resting. You're going to destroy all the goodness that I've made. And I delight in what I've made. I need you to enter into that, right? Because that's delighting in me.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's mirroring God, right, and what He did. Yeah. So I want to go back to something when you shared that about the high school student who was asking you the 3 questions. Something popped into my mind that may end up being a really just horrible question, and we can cut it if it is. It's like,
Laura
Jeff,
and I will tell you.
We'll let you know, Jeff.
Yeah, let me know. So we have lived in a culture for a long time that has told kids you can do and be whatever you want.
Yeah.
Right. And that can get applied in a lot of different ways. But the classic way that it was being shared and told was to say, look, whatever you think you can be professionally, whatever, if you put your mind to it and if you dream, it's the Disney moniker, whatever you dream about, you can be. But yet, is there something about the finitude of who we are and embracing our limits that would be a contrary message that is actually a good message for us to say, hey, I can't be anything and everything I might set my mind to, and that's okay. That's a good thing, and that's actually something that I should rejoice in.
Yeah.
What would you say to that?
Yeah, I think there's actually a lot of good to that. It's fascinating. You just take people, not just throughout history, but around the world to this day. Like, even take England. People think England's basically America, right? But my wife and I, when we lived there for 3 years, we would regularly hear British people say, like, one of the fundamental differences is you guys tell your kids, you can be anything, you can do everything. We would never say that. That's stupid, right? And that sounds offensive to us as Americans because that's so deep in us, right? But I don't think we understand also how cultural that is. That it is there is a lot of mythology built around that. That we celebrate the stories, often selectively told, of people who achieve these amazing things and but we ignore any of the damage and the dead bodies in the wake of it.
Oh, that's so good.
Right?
There's a lot
And
of
so,
wisdom there.
I mean, another just a practical thing, and I'm not trying to say that this is all up to this particular point. It's a far more complicated, but people are getting married later and later and later and marriage rates, even in America, are going down. But now, the average rate age, I think last I checked, is like 28 or something. That's not bad, but it's older. But one of the reasons seems to be, there's a sociologist at one of the universities in Dallas who's done a bunch of work on this. But part of it is, say 50 years ago, the idea was marriage is what you did as a foundation, and then you got the job and you did this, and maybe eventually get a house and that kind of thing.
It was that first
but it's
milestone.
Foundational, right? And now marriage is the pinnacle. So the idea is you should get a really good job. You should start being really financially successful. You should travel the world. You should do all of these kind of things. Well, the reason why I'm even bringing that up is it's this narrative in our minds that's often not very realistic and crushes people. Because you think, to limit myself with a human being, that's not life, that's death, right? That's a terrible thing. I'll do that later because there's so many other things I should do.
Yeah.
And I just this morning, I was talking with someone from out of state, and their adult child checked into a suicidal. It was having suicidal ideations, and it was a loneliness.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm not saying it's all linked, but it's an example of when what sounds great, like you should be able to do all of these things.
Yeah.
Unlimited possibilities has problems to it.
Yeah.
Well, and I see it even with my kids are, my oldest is about to turn 11.
Yeah.
And at that age, there are kids struggling with anxiety.
Totally.
And you wonder if this idea of getting to be everything and do everything, if it's actually more crushing than liberating.
And knowing everything.
Oh,
Yeah.
absolutely.
I think we know so much because we have information constantly at our fingertips, constantly. I think, this is not biblical either, but I think there's a lot of truth in this saying, ignorance is bliss. There was a lot more happiness when it took 2 weeks for world news to reach to our doorstep. You know? And it wasn't just constantly being fed to us with notifications and everything else through our news apps. There's, the unlimited nature of information, of all, what you're saying, Laura, is, I'm over here thinking about how for centuries and millennia before, for the most part, humans stayed in one area of the world their entire lives, working in one familial, passed down through the generations trade.
Yep.
Right? And that was life. And there was for the Christian in that context, it was great joy. For the most part, there's always exceptions, but in general, there was great joy.
There's challenges in that society. Like in the medieval, there's interesting studies on the average person didn't travel more than 30 miles in their whole life.
Right.
And they knew up to 100 to 120 people, something like that.
Yeah.
That's very wild, right?
Yeah.
The potential negative is God may have given you gifts, but they don't fit the narrative of where you're in. So there are some problems with it, but it is so different. And now we've gone so far to another extreme. I mean, even when you were talking, Jeff, I was thinking about this kind of silly example, but my wife and I talk about this all the time. So again, when we were living overseas, we'd occasionally come back to be with family, like at Christmas or something. But because things were cheaper here, we'd inevitably go to the grocery store to get some stuff to take back. And I'll never forget, one of these Christmases, we've been living overseas a couple of years, and my wife and I kind of spread out, and she said, "Go get floss." Right? So I went to the floss aisle and I got stuck, and she came 5 minutes later. She was like, "What are you still doing?" And I said, "I'm just overwhelmed by all the options."
Yeah.
And she was annoyed. And then she started looking, and 3 minutes later, we left with no floss.
It's too much.
There was so many options. And that's a perfect example where I don't think we realize how culturally that endless possibilities
And we're stuck.
aren't always your friend, right?
Yeah. And I hear you so loud on that one, but because, and I don't want to be misunderstood to say, hey, back in the Middle Ages and whatever, man, if we could just go back to that. No.
Right.
Life has always been broken since Genesis 3, right? I mean, it's broken, it's hard, it's difficult. The curse is real, right?
Yeah.
And so there's no greater time than this or what, all that mess.
Right.
So, but what I'm saying is, what is it about what feels like the ways in which we're trying to present life with unlimited options is actually working against the way God designed us to embrace the limited ways in which we exist, so that we do what? So that we depend on Him, so that we see our need for Him, and so that we, to bring it back to this fourth commandment, so that we realize, hey, He actually orchestrated into the fabric of life the need to rest, right? And even this limitless God who doesn't need to rest, rested. So what does that mean for me as a very limited creature? So
Let me ask you this. So Sabbath, there's different paradigms people think through as far as how we as believers are supposed to engage culture. There's, I think it was Plantinga that talks about, are we supposed to be completely separate? Are we supposed to be completely assimilated to? And he presents this third idea of engaging with culture. I mean, the biblical idea of being in the world but not of it. How would you apply that to the Sabbath? I know some people. You mentioned being at a Christian school, different denominations. I remember I was at a Bible college where someone came from a denomination that they didn't use their oven on Sunday.
Yeah, sure.
But we do live in this world where there are a lot of things going on, whether it's sports, all of this. Do you have any pointers for us as humans, but even also as parents, as we're trying to navigate all the different things that are happening on Sunday, but still instilling in our children this view that God teaches us of the Sabbath?
Yeah, that's great. Well, I get to get off this podcast in a few minutes, and I don't live there, so I can say whatever.
There you go, man. Let it rip.
That's why we're asking, man.
So it's very interesting. Like I'm not going to get into, and you're not asking this. Rules and regulations, I think, always go sideways. It's very interesting when I will speak in an environment that's been very strongly Sabbatarian, and we start talking about Sabbath. You can tell the average congregation member is like, "Oh, please no." Right? Because they're just because the Sabbath isn't joyful. It isn't good. It's just a list of rules of do's and don'ts. But when you go in other evangelical circles who know it's in the Bible but never thought it applied, there's only 9 commandments, and you start to say, no, you should have a day of rest. Like, this is God's way of saying the world doesn't depend on you. Praise me for it, right?
Yeah.
Then all of a sudden it becomes very, very good and promising. But the more controversial thing, as I was listening to you ask, and this was someone else who said this in Dallas, but I agreed with it. It was fascinating. He was saying he'd written a book on discipleship, and he said, he was asked, maybe it was Colin Hansen who asked him, but he said, what is more damaging to Christian youth right now? Critical theory or sports on Sunday, organized sports on Sunday.
Yeah.
And you can imagine, like, in the Southeast, this is people are gonna go crazy over this.
Yes.
So I'm not at your church, I can say that. But if you ask me that painful question, honestly, I would say kids are being catechized in our circles by not coming to church on a very regular basis, because whether we like it or not, and I love football, I watch football on Sunday. I'm not trying to be legalistic. I'm just saying there are ways that we communicate certain things.
Sure.
So this isn't about a bunch of do's and don'ts, but I would say at a basis of Sabbath is we enter into God's rest. And biblically, the primary way we enter in is with God's people. So I think that starts as the basis. And then, I think we have to navigate it with wisdom and community. I sometimes say, landscapers, they probably shouldn't work in their yard on Sunday because it's work for them. But I'm a professor, and for me to have my hands in the dirt is a great gift.
Yeah.
It's so healing. So I'm not interested in rules, but I do think like corporate worship has just got to be central to this whole thing.
Yeah.
Because otherwise it just becomes something else than biblical rest.
Yeah, that's good. It recenters us in the ways that we need to be recentered. Hey, coincidentally, I also went to a Bible college, University of Alabama. It's and we don't play football there on Sundays, so we're resting well there.
Yes.
Anyone
holy
who's upset
people.
about the rec league sports comments, to take it up with Jeff.
Yeah, and look, when you come to me, I'll say, "Look, Kelly's the one that said it, not me." And then I'll
That's
whisper
fine.
very
That is
quietly,
true.
"But I do agree with Kelly."
Yeah.
No, it is. We live that life, man. I mean, our kids are super
It's
involved.
so hard. I get it.
Yeah. But I feel often, and we wrestle. Rachel and I wrestle with our own convictions, and we've been very
It's so
upfront with our
hard.
kids. We've told them, look, you may be really upset with us, but church worshiping with God's people on the Sabbath is priority. And it's hard. I talk to a lot of parents, especially dads in our church,
Yeah.
who, our world with my daughters, my son's in college. He was not into sports anyway. He's a hunter fisherman, that kind of guy. So it was never a battle with him, but our girls are into competitive cheer and lacrosse and those kind of things.
Sure.
And our issues aren't so much games and stuff on Sundays, but it's practices on Sundays.
Right.
And there have been several times where we've just let the coaches know, hey, look, she won't be there on Sunday. And there's a bit of an embarrassment for our daughters on that. They're like, but it's like, it is what it is. And we're going to commit to this.
Yeah.
But one of the things we've wrestled with, here's a question I want to ask you, Kelly, is help us understand what if we're going to honor the Sabbath, what do we do? What does it actually look like? Does it just mean going to church? Is like, have I honored the Sabbath if I just go to church and then the rest of the day is just whatever, however I want to spend it, Or is there more to it than that? What does rest look like? Is it going to church and then going home and sleeping the rest of the day? Like, what is it? What do we do? And I know, listen, what I'm not asking for, because I'm with you on this, I'm not asking for, hey, give us rules and do's and don'ts.
Right.
But give us more.
Maybe goals.
It is very hard, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's the reason why the appropriate reason why I think we're hesitant to give rules. I mean, the Bible does say interesting things about this, right? So, because it is a day of rest, but that rest includes worship, but it also will talk about caring for those who are materially in need. Right. And if you see an ox in a ditch, you should care about it, right? If you need to take your animal to the vet or whatever. So, and kind of as Laura was saying, it's pretty hard to think through how to do this honoring of God and rest in the world we live in right now.
Yeah.
Right. I remember, what was the vice president? Why can't I think of his name all of a sudden? Who was a Sabbath keeping? Joe Lieberman.
Lieberman, yeah.
Not vice president, but Joe Lieberman. So Lieberman was a Sabbath keeping, but occasionally he'd have to go to Congress for a Sunday vote, and so he would have his assistant come because he had to ride the rail, and the assistant would swipe the card so he could get through.
Wow.
And you're like, so there's something honorable about what he's trying to do.
Yeah.
But you can tell, like, how does this work, right?
Yeah.
Can you get so?
Are you bound by what you've set in place to quote unquote honor the Sabbath? Right. Like it becomes legalistic in many ways, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And that's, I just think, the constant temptation. And so I do think it depends. I know nurses who, for them to get to church, it's a huge, given their schedules, it's this huge thing. And then maybe they actually should just sleep the rest of the day.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
And they're, so I think for a lot of us, it's what a great time to reconnect with God and family and neighbor. People are feeling like, I'm not spending enough time with my kids. Pour yourself into that. Just be present. That doesn't mean like you have to stare at them the whole time, but it's like just being together in a different kind of way. And in some ways, talking about God's goodness in the delight. Like not just talking about God's goodness at work or at church, but like take them out for a hike and be like, isn't this amazing? This is what God did, right? Building a Lego set. Look what, isn't this what, this kind of thing. So I do think there is a heightened sense that trains us for the rest of the week of just looking for God because he's always there.
Yeah.
But it's when we're at a slower pace, we're a little bit more able to recognize and give voice to.
That's so good, because I think about, I have little kids, and Sundays are not very restful.
Yeah.
There are not moments where
Yeah.
when they're awake that are restful. And
Yeah.
so I love that idea of just using it as a day to point towards God and to
Yeah.
maybe slow the pace down a little bit.
Didn't you tell me you give them Benadryl on Sundays?
don't
Is that what
say
you
that.
said? That? Yeah.
Now, you're just trying to make it so where I'm the one that gets the emails after. You're detracting from your sports comments.
That's an old skill by Jeff right there. That is a skill.
Gosh, man, you've already.
I mean, I do think that's also one of these, because I remember early on when I became Reformed, I was in a particular community, and it was a very strongly Sabbatarian community. But it always struck me, the women weren't getting a Sabbath.
Oh.
They were
Yeah.
working like crazy.
Yeah.
It was the hardest day of the week. So I do think we've got to be very careful about this kind of thing.
Yes.
It really should be this more communal kind of thing, and it's not just individualistic. And so at its base, I think the Sabbath is the breaking in of shalom for a day. Lord's Supper is this kind of pinnacle where we get a taste of being reconnected with God, reconnected with our neighbor, and reconnected rightly with God's earth. And so activities and actions and dispositions that promote renewed communion with God, neighbor, and even right relations with the earth, I think those are all what we should be about.
This is great.
Yeah, I love that you're using that language, because we use a phrase here that I may have told you about that's not unique to us by any means, but we talk about kingdom flourishing. And as we talk about kingdom flourishing, that's what we tease out. It's right relationship with God, with neighbor, with self, and in that self category, it's creation, and but how that's what God's up to, is He's bringing peace into our realities as He's doing His redemptive work in us, and just to tie the bow here in a sense, is Sabbath is a big piece of that, a big part of that, and I think for our listeners, I don't want them to be thinking, gosh, we have baseball games on Sundays and we go to those, and I'm just a terrible.
Love you.
I'm just a terrible person, and Jeff hates me, and none of that. It's just more like, it's more, the invitation is more, hey, are we thinking and considering this? Are we taking this to the Lord? Are we discussing this with our spouse? Are we struggling with the reality of what should this look like for us? And letting the Lord do what He's going to do in your conscience there. Because it's to be a blessing. It's to be the Sabbath is a blessing to us, it's not to bind us, right? So.
And we actually, go ahead.
I'm sorry, go. Well, I was just going to say, and that's the problem with me making that kind of comment about sports. It's provocative, potentially helpful, but also potentially hurtful. And that really isn't the goal. I do think there's a lot of creativity that can be thought of, and so I don't know, but I am pushing just because it's super uncomfortable to push. Yeah. And so as an outsider, I can say some of that. But I do think God delights for us to be reconnected with Him, others, in the earth. And it's just, there's so much distraction in our world. We need to fight for that. So.
No, I was actually, I have a good friend I was thinking through this with just a few weeks ago, where they have a travel team that most of it is on Saturday, but there's a few on Sunday, and they prayed about it and decided to move forward. And the thing that we were talking about was, it was really the value of the conversation they got to have with their child, where they said, okay, so we're letting you do this, but the implication is that you're going to miss something that the Bible says is for your good and for God's glory. So what are things we're going to do on those Sundays to not miss out on that thing, that good thing that God has in store? So it ended up being a really sweet conversation with them.
Yeah.
And so after this, we get to have a conversation. Our next guest is with our founding pastor, and we get to talk to him about this very same thing. But Jeff, any last words, questions?
Yeah, well, gosh, I think one last thing I would say is this. I talked to guys in my D group over the years and different guys in the church, and this is always one of the hardest conversations because there's a lot of guilt that comes with this. And one of the things I try to share with them that hopefully takes some guilt away is to say, look, if you miss a Sunday, coming to church with your family once every 3 months because of a baseball game or some sporting,
Right.
it's like, look, okay, that is what it is. And even maybe even if it's a little more frequent than that, like, let's talk about it. What we're really chasing after here, what God is really chasing after here is your heart
Yeah.
and the heart of your kids such that they're getting the value and the understanding of the rhythm of rest.
Yeah.
The rhythm of rest individually in your home and the rhythm of rest corporately in the body. And that's what we're chasing after here. So what are you doing as a dad? What are you doing as a husband? What are you doing as a man? And I'm speaking to the guys that I speak to.
Yeah.
Same for women, to establish that rhythm of rest. So
No, that's so good. And it's interesting, like, who's the Sabbath for?
yeah.
We actually start to feel like one of the reasons we feel guilty is it's like we're letting God down.
Yeah.
Here's the thing, God's fine. God's okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? He's good. He knows what we need.
Yep.
He made us. And so whether it's travel, whatever, or my life, I mean, because I travel a lot on weekends doing different things in churches and stuff, and sometimes Sundays are the worst day for me, right?
Yeah.
They're just, but I talk to travel parents too, and it's like they're worn out, and it's Sunday night, and now they got to start a new week.
Yeah.
So I do think, I like how Lauren was saying, like, this is not legalism, and it's also not like God is like fragile and he needs us every Sunday for a hit, right? He just knows how he made us. And so we are impoverished when we miss this out on right. You can go without meals sometimes, but if you start to do it too much, it actually hurts you and it starts to affect your physiology and some of these things.
That's
so
good. That's a good
maybe
one.
it just helps to remember.
So good.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is not God's insecurity or something. This is he loves us and he wants what's good for us. Like you said, Jeff, this is a good gift. Or Laura, whoever, yeah.
Yeah. Gosh, so good. Kelly, thank you. Thanks for taking time and
Thank you guys. Appreciate you.
Thanks for what a blessing you have been to us and so many through your teaching, your writings, and man. Laura, any final comments?
Well, I have about 8 more questions, but I'll just have to reach out to you apart from the podcast.
Laura will be giving you a call at some point.
I want some music about this, though. I want some music about finitude.
Got it.
I need a good Sabbath hymn from Laura.
No, I don't know about that.
Yeah. Well, Kelly, bless you, brother. And thanks for joining us. For the listeners who have joined and maybe watched on YouTube, thanks for tuning in with us. Laura already mentioned it, but we'll be talking with Randy Pope in our next episode. So stick with us for that. It's going to be a great blessing too.